Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Author in Residence series on When Women Lead with Julia Boorstin. My name is Colin Mahan. I'm a Director of Programs at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit that's building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide by improving inclusion, access, and knowledge in entrepreneurship. At the center, we celebrate all entrepreneurs every day, and in October, we're celebrating National Women's Small Business Month. We hope you will join us in celebrating it too. As you will see in the chat in a moment, the NASDAQ Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So check out those links and resources in the chat. Couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Firstly, let us know where you're dialing in from in the chat. We'd love to know where you're coming from. Secondly, we're going to open up for live Q&A near the end of the event, so please submit those questions for us in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen throughout the presentation. We will try our best to get to them all. Now, none of what we do here at the center could be possible without all the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, Airbnb, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, Microsoft, BPM, and HubSpot for Startups. We're grateful and humbled by their contributions. Now, before we get started, I'm going to launch a quick poll to just take a step back and take a temperature gauge on how we are all doing today. So I'm going to launch a quick poll. Let us know how you're feeling about your business right now. Are you fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? Let us know. We use this information to fuel the wellness resources for our entrepreneurs out there across the globe. So thanks for voting. All right, Huntington, we've got Massachusetts, New York. All right, San Francisco, welcome everyone. All righty, well, I'm gonna end this poll. Oakland, all righty. I'm gonna end this poll, share those results. Looks like optimism is in the lead and there's a little bit of survival mode and anxiety out there. Hopefully our conversation today and the programs that we host in the future will help alleviate some of those sentiments. So without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome in the chat to our special guest. Julia Boorstin is a senior media and technology reporter at CNBC and the author of When Women Lead, What They Achieve, Why They Succeed, and How We Can Learn from Them. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me here. I was a little too excited. I unmuted and I turned on my camera a little early. I was so excited about being here with you.
Well, I'm excited too for this conversation. The book has so many amazing gems from so much awesome research that you've conducted over the past couple of years. So I'm stoked for this conversation. So let's just jump right in.
Thank you for having me. We're happy to share some of the things I learned. And I, like you, are very much excited about the future of entrepreneurship in America. And I'm glad so many people out there are optimistic right now.
Oh, I love it. So just to jump into the book, first of all, what a page turner. Loved every page that I read. So why is it important for women leaders all over the world to focus and utilize their unique characteristics and approaches?
Well, what I found in interviewing about 120 women and then really digging into research about what enabled those success stories to defy the odds is what I found is that the people who had succeeded did so by leading in their own ways. They weren't trying to fit into some box, some stereotype, some archetype of what they thought leaders look like, which is sort of stereotypically a white male who leads in a traditionally top-down hierarchical way. They were figuring out how to navigate challenges with their own perspective, their own approaches. And it was that understanding of their own strengths and development of those key strengths that enabled them to succeed rather than trying to fit into some mold.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much experience that you've had at Fortune and CNBC. So how did those experiences shape you and help shape this book? You've interviewed thousands and thousands of people.
I've been a business reporter for over 22 years. My first 6 years were at Fortune magazine, and then 16 years since then at CNBC. And that's right. I've interviewed literally thousands of CEOs, executives, and leaders. And I always noticed that the female founders, the female CEOs were in a small minority. And especially over the past 5 years or so, I started noticing more and more women in business. They were still in a minority, but there were more of them. And as I was struck by how unusual they are, just from a statistical standpoint, I also was struck by the fact that maybe they just weren't just exceptions to the rule. Maybe they were also exceptional in the way they were addressing challenges and opportunities. And listening to these women talk about their strategies, their approaches to things, I started to notice a real difference about the way the women were tackling problems versus the way the men were. And part of that comes down to the fact that they've had less access to capital. In 2021, female founders got about 2% of all venture capital dollars. That's down from an average of 3% over the prior decade. So I think those constraints have forced a real grit and ingenuity among female founders, which on some occasions has some upside advantages.
Of course. And I read a statistic not too long ago that venture-backed companies by female founders are statistically more successful by the numbers then.
Yeah, and I have a lot of that research in my book. There's some interesting studies, some by venture capital firms of their own investments, others by firms such as BCG. So you'll have to find it all in the book.
Amazing. So speaking of data, why is it important to lay out the data about the challenges women face in business? And then you talked a little bit about venture capital funding, but what do you think some of the gaps are that you've based on your conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously there are these massive gaps in venture capital funding. You also see massive gender gaps in terms of the cap tables. So even women who are raising venture capital funding and growing their companies, they often own less of their companies than comparable men do. You know, there's just there's a discrepancy in terms of how much of their companies women give up in exchange for those VC dollars. And then beyond just that VC disconnect, there's so much research about how women are treated differently through the fundraising process and also judged more harshly as leaders. And I'm an optimist fundamentally. I'm very hopeful about these women creating successful companies. I'm hopeful about innovation and entrepreneurship. So it was hard for me to dig through all this data and not just find it overwhelming and depressing. But what was most hopeful for me is that in talking to the women about how they had managed to survive despite being told no literally thousands of times, I found that part of their success came from not letting all the biases and challenges bother them, not let it get to them, not let it eat away at them. And a lot of that came down to knowing what to expect. So in finding all this research and in digging through hundreds of academic studies, I found that having access to these numbers can be incredibly empowering. And if you know that when you, as a female founder going into a pitch meeting, you're more likely to be asked a question about downside risk, your male counterpart is more likely to be asked a question about upside potential. If you see those statistics going in, you'll know what you're up against, and you'll know how to quickly answer the question and pivot and give give an answer similar to what your male counterpart is going to be able to give. So I think just knowledge is power. And the more I dug into the data, the more I thought this data doesn't have to be depressing. This data can be empowering. And the more we can know how to leverage it and deploy it to our advantage, the better.
Yeah, I mean, data can be a useful tool. And I love that you're using their lived experiences to help give others the power and the tools they need to get on the other side of that table. So what's the biggest takeaway you've learned from interviewing? Again, we've talked about thousands and thousands of CEOs and executives. Your work with Disruptor 50 is amazing. But you've talked to Katrina Lake, Gwyneth Paltrow. So what's one of your biggest takeaways from interviewing all those amazing leaders?
Well, one thing I would say is there's not just one way to lead. Successful leadership in business comes in every sort of shape and size. And I think people need to understand that though there is this stereotype of the visionary genius founder who goes on to scale a company, the whole cliche of move fast and break things, which is something that Facebook used to have up around its offices in the very early days. That is not the way business is actually run. And it actually, just reflecting on what I've learned in my book tour, there were some women I talked to who were sort of on the track to be COOs. They were in operational roles at startups. And they said, I'd love to found a company, but I don't see myself as kind of the kooky visionary. I'm more get it done kind of person. And I think that the imagery and the archetypes have been really powerful in our society and aren't actually accurate, right? Like being a kooky visionary may work for a couple of people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, but fundamentally you have to get stuff done. And it's really about the practical nuts and bolts of running a business and taking a visionary idea and making it actually work. So I was struck by the fact that there's a big disconnect between what people think is effective in business and what actually is, and that these traits that women leaders more traditionally deploy, whether it's leading with empathy or communal problem solving, bringing in perspectives from across their teams, or contextual thinking about all the related topics instead of just rushing to quickly drive for a solution. All those approaches that women have traditionally used, which have not traditionally been associated with this archetype of leadership, those are the traits that everyone, male and female, need to be leaning into right now.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, in the book, you go through so many amazing case studies. And in the book, you also share many commonalities that make women leaders all over the world uniquely shaped to lead, grow business, and navigate crises. So what's the greatest commonality between all of them? You mentioned that there's differences, but what's the greatest commonality?
A lot of differences, but I think whether it's empathy or humility or vulnerability or practicing gratitude, a commonality among all those traits, which women are more likely to have, is humility. And if you understand that you're not walking in with all the answers and you're able to then learn from people around you, then you're going to be more successful over the long run. I also really dug into how humility is a key piece of having a growth mindset. If you're not humble, you can't really embrace a growth mindset because you know everything already, right? So I think understanding how much everyone can keep on learning. These women have not only succeeded because they've created great businesses, but because they know that they as leaders are going to have to keep on iterating and evolving. It's not like you have an IPO or you raise money and then you're done, evolving as a leader. You need to keep on pushing yourselves. And I think that the women who've found great success are the ones who are incredibly self-reflective and good at saying, here's what I'm good at, here's what I'm not, here's who I need to surround myself with to complement my strengths and my weaknesses. And just being really honest about what they've got and what they don't really enables them to make progress and succeed and help their company make progress as well.
I love that. And I also love how your book makes a clear distinction between leadership and management, right? I think this book isn't called When Women Manage, because I think leaders...
Management is a piece of it. You have to manage teams, and I have chapters on that, and the idea of managing teams to be effective and pull out the best from them. But they're different. I think they're different things, and sometimes they get jammed together, or sometimes people forget about management in the leadership piece of it.
Yeah, totally. I love that. And the book also shares so many amazing stories from 60 plus female CEOs and leaders, including Whitney Wolfe Hurland and Jennifer Hyman, who have defied the odds in so many ways and transformed the businesses they're in. So what's your favorite piece of advice from them?
Favorite piece of advice. It's like picking among your children. There's no favorites. They're all so amazing. One story I love to tell, and one story I would direct everyone to read because it is so amazing, is the story of Toyin Ajayi. And I like her story because people may not know it, but people need to know about leaders like her. She's the CEO of a company called City Block Health. And to me, she really encapsulates so many of the approaches of the way female founders lead to great success, including leading with empathy, big picture problem solving, and this idea of sort of getting to the root of a problem. And City Block Health totally reimagines the healthcare system. As we all know, the American healthcare system is broken in many ways. And one reason it's broken is because healthcare providers get paid on the volume of care. If you go in, you get a lot of tests, they make money on that. They don't necessarily get paid if you get healthier and you don't need healthcare anymore, which is sort of the goal as humans. We all want to have less reason to be going to the emergency room. So Toyin had an amazing experience in Sierra Leone, helping at a pediatric hospital, which you'll all have to read about. And I won't spend too much time on that. But then she went to Boston, where she found just as many problems with the medical system as she had seen in Sierra Leone. She saw that week after week, people were coming into the hospital who had been discharged. So someone would come to the emergency room, they'd give them a sandwich. Maybe these people were homeless. They'd help them with whatever immediate medical issue they had, and then they discharge them off into the streets. So Boston is a high resource city and a state with amazing healthcare, and yet they still were not really helping people get better. So one day she looked at a patient, and she realized this patient had not come into the doctor's office for 30 years and had undiagnosed breast cancer. And so she was like, why were they afraid of coming in? Why did they wait until it was this late? And she realized that there wasn't trust, which is something that female leaders are better at building. And she said, I need to be empathetic to the real challenges here. So she created a system to really address that. City Block Health shifts the power dynamic. The patient is in charge. Often the doctors visit the patients in their homes, which you almost never see otherwise. And it was all about getting to the heart of the problem. Why are we not helping people actually get healthier? And so much of that, especially with low-income populations, is about getting better access to social services, getting housing. So they, as part of their healthcare system, they have people who are effectively social workers really helping their patients get better. And it turns the healthcare system on its head. But what I think is so interesting about Toyin as a leader is she really thought, like, I'm not going to keep doing things the same way. Right. And that's why I feel like the Disruptor 50 is so important. Like, people have been doing things the same way. It's really easy to maintain these cycles, but it's so essential to say, what is actually the problem here? It's not that this person, has an injury in their leg. It's that this person isn't getting healthier for years. And to really take a step back, see the big picture, and to pull on these threads that are related, but not central to the idea of like medical health. And I think that encompasses this big picture problem solving, empathy, building trust. One of the other CEOs calls it building radical trust, and trying to shift a system instead of just making things slightly better.
Yeah, I love that. How entrepreneurial of them, and you, for so many reasons. So I was loving this in the book when I was diving in. And because there's so much interesting data around this that you picked up. And so what was the most interesting study / piece of data that you found about why women have been so underrepresented in leadership?
Oh, there are so many good studies in here, but there's one that comes to mind, which is kind of a funny one, and it was surprising to me. But it's a study of jockeys, actually. Horse racing is a rare sport where men and women compete directly against each other, not on teams like mixed doubles and tennis, but they're actually competing against each other. And there were a couple of studies of jockeys, both in the UK and US. And what they found is that the betting public only underestimated female jockeys slightly. They would assume the male jockeys would do better. They underestimated the female jockeys slightly based on their performance. But in the types of races where there were many fewer women, where women rarely competed, that's where women were underestimated the most. And this was found in various studies. So what this effectively showed is that if you don't see someone doing something, you assume that someone is not going to be good at that. If you don't see women competing in hurdle races, in horse racing, you are like, women must not be good in horse racing. And you discount their abilities because you don't see them frequently in that role. The same thing holds true for female CEOs. The public assumes that people are not good at something if they don't see them doing that a lot. So the fact that CEOs are rare reinforces subtly a stereotype that women are not good at that. And so there are these self-fulfilling, not self-fulfilling prophecies, but these vicious cycles rather that continue because of a lack of representation. And that's why elevating the women in this book is so important, because we need to have more examples of successful female leaders in order for people to see that women can be successful leaders. Is that circular?
Oh yeah, no, that hits it right on the head. I think in so many ways, at the center also, we try to highlight founders from underserved communities all over the world, just so somebody can see them showcase and say, hey, that looks like me, I can do that too. So it's on so many levels.
Representation matters, 100%. Representation matters.
Totally. So based on, I love all the research in this book, but based on your research, how can women overcome these challenges that they're dealing with in the ecosystem at large? And I know that's like the largest how do you boil the ocean question, but what's some of the advice?
Well, I think the first step is understanding the roadblocks. And, you can't scale a mountain unless you know how high it is. You can't bust through a boulder unless you know how big it is. Data, I will say this over and over and over again. Information is power, knowledge is power. Have the knowledge. So two things are possible. One, so that you can know when someone is saying something to you that seems biased, so you can separate the bias from the useful feedback. If I've gotten feedback that parts of it are valuable, parts of it are biased, but I want to be able to learn from the feedback. Back to the point is that one thing all these women had in common is they really were able to keep on learning and pushing themselves. You can't learn and keep on growing if every time someone gives you biased feedback, it just gets you down and you feel discriminated against. You need to be able to separate the bias from the useful stuff and then keep on learning and growing. And there's one entrepreneur who puts it in a way that was really valuable for me, which I think about a lot, which is her name is Avid Reader, and she's the CEO. She was the founder of a company called Little Bits that she then sold. It was a kids tech company. And she's a Lebanese immigrant and faced all sorts of different kinds of bias and discrimination. And I asked her, I said, how did you keep on going when you were asked these horrible questions during pitch meetings? You were rejected dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And people would ask you, like, where's the engineer? And she'd say, I'm the engineer. Or are you going to hire a white man to found this company with you? And she'd say, no. So my mind was boggled that she didn't let this stuff get to her and give up. And she said, I think about facing bias, like remembering to wear a jacket when it's cold out. If you bring your jacket, you won't get cold. I mean, you'll feel that it's cold, but you won't let it doesn't bother you in the same way. And so I very much think about this data as being like a jacket for when it's cold out. You have all the numbers in this book. They're going to tell you, you can say, I've marked mine up. You have the numbers in the book. You know, if someone says something, you're like, oh, I think that might actually be because he has the assumption that I'm going to be warm because I'm a woman and I don't fit that stereotype. So it's hard for him to place me in one of the patterns that he's used to seeing. So I think just being able to identify it allows you to move past it, but even more importantly, allows you to derive from those conversations or from those experiences that might be a little painful, to derive the pieces that are valuable. And that is the valuable feedback. People are going to fail all the time. The more you get used to failing and learning from the failure, the more successful you will be over the long run. But also you're going to face bias and discrimination. The more you can take the valuable pieces from those interactions and not let that eat away at you, the more successful you will be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also, I mean, you interview disruptors, and if you will allow me, you are a disruptor in some ways. But so based on all of these conversations that you've had, what did you find out about these women disruptors in established, old school, probably old white guy in a suit dominated industries?
I think that we talk a lot about how being outsiders is a bad thing. It feels yucky not to be inside the boys club sometimes. But I actually think for women or for anyone who's in a minority group in business, being an outsider can also offer an advantage. And clearly I'm an optimist here, but I did see how so many women use their outsider perspective to create solutions to problems that people in the mainstream corporate culture had not identified. So part of it is women are creating opportunities, identifying opportunities in the femtech space, whether it's fertility or menopause or all of these sectors of the healthcare system that have been totally overlooked for so long. Now you're seeing women say, hey, I understand the value here. Let me invest in that. So I think there's that piece of sort of like seeing opportunity as outsiders, but also having that combination of the insider experience and the outsider perspective enables you to create companies that could maybe innovate on problems or failures of the system itself. So I think that's something that I've seen in whether it's Sally Krawcheck with Ellevest or even Reese Witherspoon and Sarah Hardin with Hello Sunshine. These are people who were successful or had enough success within the status quo system that they could have kept on operating at other companies within that industry, whether it was the dating industry or Hollywood. But Whitney Wolfe Herd said, I'm going to turn the whole dating system on its head. And I'm going to make sure that women are the only ones that can make the first move. And Sarah Hardin and Reese Witherspoon said, we're not going to keep on just going along with the studio system that isn't giving us what we need, which is, smart content for and by women. We are going to go do that ourselves. So I think whenever you have a situation that seems like it puts you at a disadvantage, I think it's really important to take a step back and figure out, wait, is there a way I could take this fact that I'm on the outside or I'm on the periphery or I've had things that seem unconquerable and use that distinct perspective to start to change things.
I love that. And you're also joining Sally in our Author in Residence series, I guess, Rolodex. So next time you run into her, ask her how being on the series was for her, because I had a good time with her on the green room.
She's awesome. She has such amazing stories. And by the way, she has really led the transformation of the culture of these of these financial services companies. So you'll have to see what I wrote in the book about her and this idea of cultural numbness, which she rejects.
Ooh, yes, we love that.
With the T.
So I love how research and data focused your entire book is. And I know that based on even just the poll that we submitted at the beginning of this on, there is some anxiety and a little bit of survival mode in entrepreneurship. And I think just across the world, we're still on Zoom. So what did your research reveal about the advantages of having women in leadership during the pandemic over these past 2 years?
Well, so look, this is an uncertain time now. I feel like we're just in this long, drawn out period of crazy uncertainty. And now it's not just about the pandemic. It's about potential recession. Are we already in a recession? Are we not? Inflation at record highs. There's still war going on. I mean, there's so many different types of uncertainty and volatility right now. But during the pandemic and during past crises, female-led companies have outperformed. One study I like to look at is from the financial crisis, female-led regional banks, because regional banks are actually pretty easy to compare to each other. And during the financial crisis of 08-09, female-led banks performed better. And the researchers found that was largely because going into the financial crisis, those banks had taken more moderate risks. They had not been as risky. If you look at the data so far during the pandemic, the numbers also indicate that female-led organizations performed better. If you look at country comparisons, female-led countries versus very similar male-led countries, the female-led countries did a much better job at minimizing death in that key first year. If you look at female-led states, female governors versus male governors, even those with very similar political policies and COVID policies, the female-led states did a better job at minimizing death. At the corporate level, we've seen so many female-led companies be better in terms of adaptability. And it's still early days. And look, we've had the tech sell-off, so it's still hard to tell. But in terms of this, what they call the adaptability quotient, female leaders tend to rank higher in adaptability, and female leaders are actually more in demand by employees during times of crisis. So in uncertain times, employees would rather have a female boss than a male boss, which is not true necessarily in other times.
Oh, yeah. And that reminds me, you were talking about leaders of countries. Yeah, guess what country had the lowest COVID rate? New Zealand. Part of the reason is because of their female leader, but also
they had other advantages being island nations and all
small.
that. But
I
write about a study in the book that there was actually a study done before the pandemic trying to predict how different countries would react or how they would perform in terms of health outcomes if there was a global pandemic. And this was done like a year before the pandemic. And what they predicted was entirely wrong, right? They thought that the US and Britain would do the best. That was not true. So you got to read this study in the book. It's mind-boggling. I
love it. And I'm just going to pause it for some comments from the team here on the call. Somebody, Jenny says, "Go Julia," big friend from the Bay Area. And then we also have Evie saying, "Thank you for sharing so many wonderful lived experiences, true stories and observations. Love the research and the value of meaningful data makes the invisible visible." And this is from a woman CEO. And she says, "Hello, and thank you so much."
Well, we don't want female founders of color to be invisible. They shouldn't be invisible. And I think in the media, too often they are, because there's so much attention on the big public companies, or frankly, on the big failures, the people like Elizabeth Holmes, and that eats up all the oxygen in the room. So my book is about shifting the conversations away from the focus on people who've done things wrong to people who are doing things right. And that, I think, are these remarkable women.
Yeah, and I think it's an amazing spotlight. So going through this book isn't just for women. So can you explain why these lessons are also applicable for male leaders and just everyone?
Yes. Well, back to the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic with all this uncertainty we were just talking about, now more than ever, people, male and female, people of any gender, leaders need to reevaluate their management and leadership styles. Management in terms of connecting with their employees, figuring out what their community, whether it's customers or their network needs, their partners need. The stakes are higher than ever because of the uncertainty, and the need for these more traditionally female skills, whether it's empathy or vulnerability, are higher than ever. These are table stakes right now. And I think what's interesting is I saw a question in here about whether female bosses would be weak. And there's a stereotype that some of these characteristics, like showing vulnerability, is a sign of weakness. But what we've actually seen is that that's really just a stereotype, that you have to act strong to be a strong leader. In fact, showing vulnerability can make you the strongest leader possible. And so many of these things that have been associated not with power, but with weakness, like empathy and vulnerability, are actually sources of strength. And I think right now, it's the time for men, women, any people of any gender to start thinking about what's going to make me successful right now. It's not what worked 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm not sure if what worked 10 years ago is really working for employees that well. So now it's different trying to manage employees. It's different trying to get the most out of teams, especially if those teams are dispersed and coming at things from different perspectives. And your relationships with whether it's suppliers or partners or investors, everything's fraught right now because the economy is in turmoil. So I think this is the time for men to try to break free from their assumptions and stereotypes about what makes leadership successful and what makes them powerful, and shift the conversation about power, because superpowers are sometimes things that have nothing to do with power itself.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree with you on that one more. So speaking of the gentlemen who are on this call or out there in the ecosystem, what's the first step that men and women should take to start applying your advice tomorrow?
Tomorrow. Well, I think it depends where you're coming from. If you're a leader already, or if you'd like to become a leader. But I think one key thing is everyone needs to do a deep dive into the data. Just read the first chapter of my book and you'll understand what I'm talking about. There are gender gaps and disparities that people are not aware of. So much so that I've had people question me whether, including the copy editor of my book, whether there were typos because the numbers were so small of what the amount of capital that was going to female founders and women of color. I was like, these are not typos. That's why I'm writing this book. They're not typos. So I think that's part of it, is understanding the data. And then I think also checking our own assumptions. I write in the book a lot about pattern matching. I think, we talk about unconscious bias, but there's something more basic than unconscious bias that influences us every day. And that is pattern matching. There's a human instinct to try to create patterns among people and ideas. And for investors, that means they're looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg. And what that means is if a woman had invented Amazon, she might still be trying to raise money, right? Because they're like, she doesn't, oh, what a cute little retail site, not this is a game-changing e-commerce giant. So I think this is importance of understanding pattern matching and the power of pattern matching to have a negative impact. I mean, we used to talk about pattern matching as a good thing. Like, how are you going to find the next great investment? Look at what's worked in the past. Now it's like, make sure you don't get stuck in a feedback loop. Make sure you're not stuck in a homogenous group of people. And so I think identifying patterns that you may rely on and trying to break free of them. And above all else, I truly believe and have found in so much research and interviews that bias can be overcome with data. I mentioned earlier in this call that I love data, and I think it's so important. You see how data-driven this book is, but I think that whether you're hiring or promoting or trying to figure out a strategy, instincts only get you so far. And in fact, in hiring and promoting, instincts are generally driven by personal bias and pattern matching. And the more you can look to data, the more you'll be able to strip out bias from the equation.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much there to unpack, but I mean, I love that your book shares the stories of resilience and disruption to really showcase it for, to, as you put it, to give people more tools to be able to navigate the ecosystem. One of the traits that you talked about in your book is the ability to create new communities. Can you talk a little bit about that and your experience with that?
Oh, yes. I mean, look, the thing about communities is that we all know they feel good. It feels good to have a community, different communities to support you. But what I didn't realize going into the book is that there's hard data about how valuable communities are, both to help drive people to succeed in business, but also to overcome the negative impact of bias. So one reason I'm optimistic that women and people of color will have more opportunities is because there are more and more organizations that are creating communities to help them overcome bias simply by being around each other. So there's this fascinating study in the book that I think about a lot, this about microenvironments, how small groups of women if you put women together in small groups and then tell them that there's a stereotype that women are bad at math and engineering, then the fact that they've been with other women, like a cohort of other people like them, means that that stereotype does not have a negative impact on their performance on a test. But if you don't put women in a group of other people like them and you give them that stereotype, it really hurts their performance. So there's this idea that microenvironments, sometimes in companies, they call them affinity groups, do have a real value in helping people overcome bias. And then there's also the fact that having diverse networks, having a diverse professional network helps women in particular succeed. So for men, it was interesting because the study found that having a large network correlated with success. But for women, having a smaller but diverse network correlates with success. So that is a reminder, and this is another great takeaway. Look at who you're asking for professional advice. Make sure it's not just your friends and people you've known for a really long time. And it's not the people who are sitting next to you at work. You need people who have a little bit more perspective, and maybe a perspective that's different from yours, to get the best advice on how to succeed.
Oh, I love that so much. And, people in the ecosystem always say your network is your net worth. But I think
people need to reconsider what their network is. And I think that actually, once I saw this data, it reminded me to reach outside my comfort zone and DM people on Twitter and ask people to Zoom with me so I could, get to know them. And, building a really diverse network takes time and is an investment, but the data shows it's worth it. And by the way, that's why what you're doing here is so valuable, because you're convening people with common interests, maybe common goals, but different perspectives. And so I think, that's why I think this work that you're doing is so essential.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you. And for our entrepreneurs out there who may not have large networks or even the right network of the right types of people, you talked about DMing people on Twitter, but yeah, what's some advice about like getting a hold of folks that may or may not be appear to be attainable? Any advice about just getting a hold of somebody that's a moonshot?
But I think that's different. That's like asking for mentorship or advice. Network does not need to be, you don't need Jeff Bezos to be your mentor, right? You need, to be in your network. And you don't need to have the most exclusive, successful people in the world to be in your network. What you need is people who are driven and who are going to be honest with you and offer a fresh perspective. So I think there are a lot of organizations that have popped up, whether it's like Chief, which is for women at the VP level and above. Obviously, YPO has been around for forever. But also, there are organizations like The Crew, which offer peer coaching, and they teach women how to coach each other. So I think that's the thing, is you don't need to reach for the stars necessarily. You need to be thinking about who has a different perspective. LinkedIn is an amazing tool. I can't tell you how many CEOs who I interviewed. I said, how did you get started? How did you find people? And they said, I reached out to people on LinkedIn. So that was surprising to me. But I also think increasingly, now that there's a surge of in-person events again, people are going to events and connecting there. And I think there was a real hunger for connection. And from what I've seen, just especially in the past couple of weeks, there's a real hunger for people to help each other. I think people really want to help each other through whatever this weird economic cycle is that we're in right now.
Yeah, and whatever the new set of normal that we're all living through right now. And so I guess culture comes up a ton. And based on your research, through the entrepreneurs that you've spoken with, how are they approaching company culture and managing the people around them differently than their male counterparts?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I just did an interview with Donna Langley, who runs Universal Pictures, Universal Filmed Entertainment Group at my sister company. So she's the sister company at NBC Universal. And she was talking about how someone, told her early in her career that you can be decent and also successful. And at that time, there was this idea that if you wanted to succeed, you had to be ruthless. And he said, you can be decent, that you can be good and also good at business. And I think that there's so much research about how female leaders are more likely to invest in mentorship and also to care more and do more around diversity, both in terms of race and in terms of gender. So I think that this idea of creating a culture that's inclusive and diverse is incredibly valuable. And maybe women have more traditionally done it, but everyone needs to be doing it. right now. And also, I think that's why vulnerability comes into play, is you're going to have people feel more comfortable sharing their ideas, and being open about what they don't know, or maybe what they think might be right that they would be afraid to bring up, in a culture where the CEO doesn't say they know it all.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, back to your humility point in the
Yeah.
book, right? I mean, that's really big. We're all human, right? So for the early stage women leaders in the group that we've got, and just in the ecosystem, what's some of the advice that will potentially help them through the trials and tribulations of just being an early stage entrepreneur in general? Any advice that you got from your
Yeah,
interview
well, I think
there?
there's a lot of data in the first chapter of my book that will be very helpful to you. So please read that. I also think that Allraise is an amazing resource. And in addition to these other groups, Allraise is really focused on founders and funders, and help getting more women and diversity into the ecosystem. And they also run cohorts trying to pair you with other people, or in other companies are at the same stage, with the idea that not only can you get advice from the organization, but you can also learn and grow together. So I think creating your own community, and tapping into some of these organizations can be an incredible opportunity, an incredible advantage. And this is hard. Building a business is hard, and you don't want to have to do it alone.
Yeah, the tide rises together, as they say. And we interviewed recently a woman who's a rock star early stage entrepreneur in DC, and she has the most powerful, interesting network out of anybody I've ever met. And she's like, the one thing that I didn't realize until later in my life was following up is like one of the most important things to do. Even if it's like you had a conversation with somebody and nothing actually came from it, she's like, just follow up, let people know how the conversation went, how the activities went.
And actually Jennifer Hyman, the CEO and founder of Run the Runaway, she talks about this too. She talks about how if she gets advice from someone, she will follow up, not just with a handwritten note to thank them for meeting with her, but months and even years later to say, I'm still thinking about that advice you gave me. I'm so grateful you told me that. And this idea that if you tell people how much you value their advice or their feedback, then they're going to be more likely to keep giving it to you because they feel valued. And I always joke when I'm asking my kids to say please and thank you, like, words are free. Words are free, and you should give them freely. If you're grateful to someone, you need to go out of your way to say that, because doesn't cost you anything, and it could yield massive returns.
Yeah, I love all this advice. We're about to jump into a live Q&A, but Julia, if somebody were to dial in to the last portion of this interview with me, what's one key takeaway that you would share with all of our listeners, that having read every page of the book is one thing that they would tell everyone?
Data matters. Data will help overcome bias, and knowledge is power. So use the data to your advantage, and don't try to fit yourself into any kind of box. Everyone succeeds when they are their own type of leader, and knowing who you are and what you're up against is the best way to do that.
Oh, I love that. And authenticity is rewarded so much in business, and just also in entrepreneurship. Before we jump into live Q&A, and if you haven't dropped your question into the Q&A box, do so now. I've seen some in the chat. So if you could just drop those in the Q&A box so they don't get lost. But before I jump into Q&A, I've got a quick poll for the entrepreneurs on this call on what's keeping you up at night. We use this information to really guide the next couple months of content that we provide for you, the entrepreneurs we serve. So is it finance, marketing, team, sales? Also, I'll use this fuel to help the discussion with Julia here. So appreciate you voting. I'm going to end this poll in a moment, but there's a little competition here. Looks like team is at the top of the key, followed by marketing and finance, which is totally understandable. So to dive into some of these questions, thanks for all of these. Let's see. One of my biggest roadblocks is not men, but other women. Call it insecurity on their part, or trying to prove themselves. I think it's part of the competitive nature that the men have created in this industry. But how do you navigate this?
Well, it's interesting because I think whoever asked that question is right, that it's a competitive nature that men have created. because frankly, the business culture has so far been created by men. I have noticed in my experience, and this is a complicated one because there's not a lot of data about whether, about this cliche about whether women are mean to each other. But what I've noticed is that in the 80s and 90s, when there was really room for only one woman on a C-suite or on a board or wherever, there was only room for one woman in the room. Women did not have an incentive to help each other. And they were in fact incentivized to discourage the success of other women because they knew there's only room for one of them. I have noticed in my own experience and in all of these CEOs I've interviewed that has changed with time. And that's because women are seeing that they will be more successful if they have other women around them. And there is now no longer that, room for only one issue. There is an expectation that there should be more than one woman in different scenarios. And that shift in terms of the expectations and the sort of mere room for women, I think does have a bigger impact than we can imagine. So there's this idea of token theory that if there's only one person, they're going to be scrutinized more closely. Once you get to a critical mass, 20 or 30% of a group, that's when that minority group can start to affect real change. That's why women are better off if there are other women around them. So I think it's a shame if women are letting those stereotypes or those expectations of infighting established by their male bosses to define them. But I think that I'm hopeful based on what I've seen that women will understand that collaboration is more valuable.
Yeah, and your book talks a lot about the leaders lifting as they climbed, right? It's not like they were kicking down, it's they were lifting up along their journey. Another question here. So they were given feedback that the reason they don't get invited to travel is because certain men fear to be alone with women during travel to avoid rumors or be put in a situation of harassment. How do you combat that?
So what we're talking about here is post Me Too Time's Up backlash. And I've heard about this a lot. Some companies are being careful about this in terms of, for instance, getting rid of late night post-work drinks. Some CEOs are saying, I'm not going to meet people for drinks after work. I'm only going to meet people for breakfast. And I'm going to make sure that I have, breakfast with men and women at the same numbers that they're represented in my company. And to just being very intentional about that. I would say that person who, if they're excluded from travel, and if they're missing out on business opportunities, I would flag that as like a kind of discrimination. Like if that fear is preventing them from having opportunity to succeed, then that's really problematic. So I think that there is a post Me Too Time's Up backlash. I don't know how long it'll go on for or what's next, but one reason I wanted to write this book is to shift the conversation away from what people were doing wrong to what women are doing right. But I do think that's a potentially very negative thing if you're really getting excluded from opportunities.
Totally. But I think what you highlighted is important, right? I mean, it's a reality and people are dealing with it in different ways, but yeah, it still does suck.
Yeah, but it shouldn't, I mean, by the way, it's probably not, I don't think a company would consciously understand, like go forward with those kinds of policies if they understand that they are, decisively holding women back in those situations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talk a lot about, the communities of mentorship for the women leaders that you've interviewed, and I'm sure you have tons of mentors as just the leader that you are. And we, of course, at the center promote and support mentorship across all stages, industries, backgrounds, and geographies. So we have a question here that I think is interesting. So how do you get mentorship off the ground? Most women who I ask to mentor me feel they don't think they can offer enough or think they aren't important enough to mentor.
Well, that ties into the imposter syndrome that those women are probably facing. And I would remind the potential mentors and the mentees that you don't need to be that much more senior to be a mentor. And I hope that aspiring mentee will tell those women, look, I know you're not running the company, but I still think that what you have to offer is valuable. So I think that's key. I also think that women need to be mentored by men as well as women. Some of my most impactful mentors were men. And frankly, there aren't enough women in C-suite roles for only the women to be doing the mentoring of the women. We need men and women to be mentoring. And I think that is in fact even more important for men to mentor younger women if men are in greater representation at the top of a company.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I mean, mentorship is a two-way street too.
Yeah.
We get a lot of mentoring. I learned so much from my mentees.
Yeah.
It's not easy to get over the imposter syndrome, but if you miss every shot you don't take, I guess is my
Exactly.
advice there. Let's see. This is an interesting question that I don't even know the answer to myself, but with COVID, comfort was brought up more to the forefront. Is it still important for women, but I think all people, to dress up and do makeup, or should we just find ourselves in sweatpants as leaders for the next eternity?
Oh, I don't know. I'm a tough one to answer that question because I'm a TV reporter. So I am wearing makeup and a blazer and all of those things. But I also feel like for me, I tried, wearing sweatpants on the bottom and business on the top, and it just didn't work for me. I didn't feel like I was really going to work, even if it was just down the hall. So I think, workplace fashion goes in waves. But I think it's the question of like, what makes you feel professional? And I actually think we're seeing a resurgence of people getting dressed up for the office because it's a fun change of pace.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm on the same boat as you, where if I am wearing sweatpants, I'm too comfortable. So like I'm actually wearing right now what I would wear if I was in the office.
Yeah.
My friends make fun of me for it all the time. But yeah, it's an interesting transition. And it depends on industry too. I mean, some people.
Yeah, totally. And by the way, a lot of industries like finance, they expect people to be in 5 days a week.
Yeah. And yeah, the commutes that I used to take every day, just a continual reminder of how much I love my job. Anyhow, what about the overlay of institutional sexism and racism? How do you lead within a culture that's so heavily influenced by these? I'm guessing it's industry based too.
Yeah, I think but I also think there's just fundamental, centuries worth of these layers of institutional, assumptions about who's going to be running things and what the promotion is, right? Who's going to be promoted. And that's why I go back to the data. I think that there are amazing hiring tools right now that can strip bias out of hiring, a movement away from reliance on the resume, which is an incredibly outdated way to hire, and very much reflective of socioeconomic opportunities that someone has and not of their talents or their potential. And so for the individuals who are struggling in those situations, I think figuring out how much what they're up against is institutional sexism or racism, and how much of it is, just feedback. And to me, it's always about distinguishing what can I take from the situation versus what is simply bias. And then figuring out what the resources are to help change some of those things. I mean, I just did something with this NBC Universal Women's Group. And if there is something that is a blatant offense of these, of company policies, or if there aren't company policies in place to ensure fair treatment, I think there are increasingly groups and organizations to help companies and help employees manage their, to have a more equitable workplace. And so I think that's something that companies are really trying to be more focused on. And frankly, I think they have to be more focused on them to succeed in this world.
Yeah. I mean, everyone across the table, customers, employees, investors, everyone's holding people accountable these days, which I really appreciate. Another question / comment here. The current moment seems to embrace the authenticity that women leaders have been trying to bring for a long time, which is what your book covers. We've always leaned into a servant leadership approach, but in recent years of scarcity and uncertainty, our teams have been exploiting that approach. So any comments there?
I write a little bit about servant leadership in the book. You'll have to flip to Shivani Saroya. She's the CEO of a company called Tala. And she leads with servant leadership approach, which, by the way, so does Howard Schultz and some very successful men. I think that goes back to this idea of burnout and connecting with employees. And in order to have that kind of trust with employees, you need to make sure you're on the same page. So, servant leadership and giving trust to employees is really predicated on the idea that they're in it with you and everyone's on the same page. And I think sometimes that's hard with remote work. I mean, I'm working from home today, but and I do about half the time, but I think that's something that's hard to navigate in light of burnout and hybrid remote work.
Yeah. Well, we're almost at time, but I want to cover a couple of these other questions that are amazing. So, I mean, as we did the sentiment poll at the beginning of this, mental wellness is, becoming increasingly important as we're all remote workers and then as entrepreneurs. It's already a lonely journey. So did you pick up any snippets of advice from all the CEOs you were talking about, or just wellness,
Yes.
taking care of oneself?
Yes. Well, so one thing I found is that a lot of these CEOs had strong identities outside of work. So that means that they had hobbies. They spent a lot of time with their family. They had these other things that they did. Work was not the only thing that defined them. And that was surprising to me, because I think that we live in a culture that celebrates just really being, laser focused on your work and running your company. But so many of these CEOs said, I'm an artist. I paint in my spare time, or I, would just put my phone away and just be with my kids for those hours. And not that you're ignoring your responsibilities, but you have built up this strong identity, and that other identity can make you more resilient in the face of workplace challenges.
Oh, I love that. And my team would giggle. I ask people what they nerd out on when I interview them. And it's like, it doesn't matter what the answer is. It's just if you have one. Like, it could be underwater basket weaving for all I care. But like, if you just say like working is my hobby, then like, that's not really the right answer.
Well, then you're going to get really burnt out.
Yeah. Well, it's been an amazing journey through the pages of this book, which I encourage everyone to check out. We've dropped links to purchase it. It's hot off the press. When Women Lead.
Yeah, it's brand new.
Brand new. Your friends are going to be talking about it. Share it with your friends, family, anybody who you think would be able to find value in all this amazing research that you've done. But Julia, I really appreciate you joining us today to share some of your experiences and some of the other experiences from the women leaders that you had the amazing ability to get a hold of and interview for this book.
Well, it was my pleasure. And I know that entrepreneurs in particular, anyone thinking about or on the entrepreneurial journey, will find this book particularly useful. There is a roadmap in here to navigate those landmines and to find success at the other end.
Oh, amazing. Well, check out that book. We've got the link for you to buy it in the chat. And for those of you who are still on, we appreciate all of you joining us today. Julia, shout out to you and sharing your wisdom with our team today. And for those of you who are still on, we've got a bunch of great webinars coming up in the next couple of months. So check that link out in the chat as well. But Julia, on behalf of everyone in attendance and everyone on our team, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Well, for those of you still on, check out our future events, give us some feedback, and we look forward to seeing you all online soon. Thanks again, Julia.